Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few seconds here. Good to see everybody. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the first in a series, Break 'em Up, Redistributing Economic Power to the People. My name is George Gale. I'm the Director of People's Action, and we're really proud to be teaming up with American Economic Liberties Project on this exact series. We're here today to dig in on the challenges posed by concentrated corporate power and what we can do about it. Actually, especially what we can do about it. I think the need for this work really sharpened for a bunch of us 12 years ago. The financial crisis of 2008 sparked something in the American consciousness. For the first time in more than a generation, a huge chunk of the country, like all at one time, was questioning our economic system. This was a big deal. And it made sense. How could a set of banks rip off millions of homeowners, send the economy to the brink, erase millions of jobs, and still be deemed too big to fail? By everyday people, not just lefty activists, to bust up the big banks. This was new. In Alicia Garza's new book, The Purpose of Power, she says that political education takes the invisible and makes it visible. The financial crisis was a political education moment for an entire nation. And this crisis, felt by every single one of us, it was a clarion call. There was suddenly no denying that something was deeply wrong with our economic system. And yet, deep in the bones of American workers, it was also clear this was not new. Runaway corporate power had been a boot on the neck of working class people of all races for decades. And the policies that made this possible, they weren't delivered in one fell swoop, but instead part of a steady march over decades, and powerful enough to wipe out the family farm, devastate manufacturing strongholds, and decimate worker power. The moment was also no accident. The moment we're in is no accident. It's the result of a carefully constructed plan, a theory of change executed with precision. And the corporate leaders and political operatives behind this movement, they had many issues on their agenda, but it's always important to remember the main agenda item, it was power. And I share all of this because I think many of us are thinking about how we defeat fascism, not just in one election, but long term. And I think if you want to beat fascism, if you want to build permanent, sustainable, low income and working class majorities that want to fight for economic, climate, racial, and gender justice, addressing the consolidation of corporate power will have to be part of that plan. As just one data point, in 2017, People's Action had 10,000 conversations with folks in small towns. And when we asked people about the declining conditions in the community and who and what was responsible, the number one answer was consolidated corporate power. And yet over and over, we heard this: no one believed that either party was ready to address this issue in a serious way and fight for them. We're going to need to change that. We're excited about today's conversation because we believe the issues we are discussing in this series are issues to be organized on, issues for which there is already a base, issues that are winners in people's lives and in our politics. And with that, I'm going to now hand it to Sarah Miller, Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. Sarah.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks to People's Action for partnering with us on this new series of events. It's inspired in part by Zafar Teachout's terrific book, Break 'em Up. Zafar's book tells a story of how monopolies and corporate power lie upstream from so many of the priorities of the progressive movement, and it makes the case that breaking that power must be deeply integrated into the progressive agenda and fight for justice. For our kickoff conversation today, we're talking about the relationship between corporate power and worker power, and I think I speak for everyone when I say we're so excited to hear shortly from Senator Bernie Sanders, and also from Congressman David Cicillin, who's been just a rock star chair of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, and of course, Zafar Teachout, and then a wonderful panel of leaders, including Vina Dubal, Sarah J. Arman, and Mike Wilson. I want to take a few minutes just to set the table for this conversation before we welcome Senator Sanders. Last month, the head of Time Warner sent a memo to his staff announcing a round of layoffs that was the result of a merger that many of us will remember of AT&T and Time Warner. He called it a very painful memo to write, and then described how the company would begin systematically eliminating redundant positions. What he didn't mention was that the former CEO of Time Warner had made $400 million for engineering the sale of his company, one of the greatest golden parachutes of all time. This story, a story of payoffs at the top and layoffs for working people, is almost too common to note. Pfizer just bought generic pharmaceutical maker Mylan and then announced plans to lay off 9,000 people. The CEO of Mylan made $30 million in the deal. So why did Pfizer even announce layoffs publicly? Probably so Wall Street would see and boost its stock price. Viacom CBS, Schwab TD Ameritrade, Merck Cubis, the list of payoffs at the top and layoffs at the bottom is long. To monopolies, and also for the last 40 years, to antitrust enforcers in large part, workers have been a cost to be shed as quickly as possible in pursuit of profits and efficiency. If you don't have to compete with anybody else, it's easier to fire people or pay and treat them badly. Amazon can hurt people who work in its warehouses and face few, if any, consequences. Workers aren't unionized and they can't easily quit and work somewhere else. The Economic Policy Institute has found that Amazon is so dominant that it sets wage levels wherever it has a significant warehouse presence. It's not just Amazon and it's not just big mergers. Safety standards during COVID, as we all have seen, are appalling, especially at places like monopolized meatpacking plants. But where else can these workers make a living? It's likely that collusion to keep down wages is endemic in the economy. Labor economists are starting to look at this question and calculate these costs, and they are major. They found that most labor markets are highly concentrated and that this concentration has significant impacts on both the availability of jobs and what these jobs pay. One study showed that corporate consolidation cost the average American household $5,000 a year in lost purchasing power. This comes in on the low end. Another found that median annual compensation would be $10,000 higher if employers were less concentrated, and possibly as much as $50,000 higher, which is not pocket change, to say the least. Fortunately, we're at a turning point, I think, and we'll talk more about that today, but policymakers are beginning to act. Just last week, the Justice Department criminally indicted someone for wage fixing, which is the first time that's ever happened. President-elect Biden has pledged to go after anti-competitive labor contracts like non-compete agreements and arbitration clauses. And antitrust enforcers are beginning to think about how to incorporate analysis of labor market effects into merger enforcement. With that, it is a huge honor to introduce someone who needs no introduction, Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders has been on the front lines of the fight against monopolies on behalf of workers for decades, whether it's his work back in the 1990s to stop the Pentagon from subsidizing mergers of defense contractors, his attempts to break up the banks during the financial crisis, as George just spoke about, his campaign to raise Amazon's minimum wage for its warehouse workers, and his focus on corporate power and inequality during his transformative and inspiring campaigns for president. Senator Sanders battled corporate power before it became a common topic of conversation, and his moral vision and relentless advocacy for working people helped pave the way for the anti-monopoly movement. We're all honored to have him with us today to talk about how we can work together to shape a new progressive America in which we see working people not as costs to be cut, but as the center of a just and flourishing society. But first, because Senator Sanders is just finishing up a caucus call, we are going to introduce and bring on Morgan Harper, who's a senior advisor with us at Economic Liberties. She formerly ran for Congress and was a policy advisor at the CFPB, and Zephyr Teachout, to begin their conversation about how monopoly power and corporate power are related. And then when Senator Sanders joins us in just a few minutes, we'll cut back and hear from him and then resume that conversation with Zephyr and Morgan. So let me go ahead and offer the stage to you two.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much to everyone for joining. I have a pleasure to introduce Zephyr Teachout and be in conversation with her today about these really important issues on corporate consolidation. Zephyr is an attorney, political activist, and antitrust and corruption expert. She previously has also run for office for the New York Attorney General in 2018 and is a professor of law at Fordham University School of Law. She's also the author of Corruption in America, in addition to Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money, which was partly the inspiration for this event series. So Zephyr, thank you for joining us as well. So you wrote the book, right? You're one of the main leaders of this anti-monopoly movement. So can you just start from the beginning a little bit and set the stage here of what do we mean by monopoly, corporate consolidation? There are a lot of terms that get thrown out there. And how did we even get to the point of needing a movement to fight these things?
Well, first of all, it's great to be in conversation with you, and what an extraordinary lineup and really important moment in American history. Let's talk about monopoly. I think there are a lot of misconceptions around the idea of antitrust, of monopoly. And so just a few basic misconceptions. One is that there are only a few monopolies, and in order for something to be a monopoly, you only need one of it. When we're talking about monopoly power, what we're talking about is corporations that have gathered so much power that they basically have the capacity to set the terms with all of their contracting partners and with society at large. So I think people often understand, like, okay, we have a monopoly because there's only one toothpaste company or two toothpaste companies, and when their prices rise, there's nowhere we can go. And so there's evidence of monopoly power because prices are rising. One of the biggest kinds of use of monopoly power we have today is corporations that have gotten so big that they are depressing wages, treating workers badly, introducing scheduling changes, differential treatment. Basically, we have 40 years of consolidation in the American corporate space. And over those 40 years, you have seen wages totally stagnant, barely growing, while Jeff Bezos and other big CEOs are taking home billions of dollars. I mean, we have Jeff Bezos making $70 billion in this pandemic alone. So I think it looked like you wanted to jump in there. But the first thing to understand is that when we're talking about monopoly power, we are talking about corporate power that has become a kind of governing power. It's starting to govern us. And it's a threat to democracy because of that.
But how did we get to this point? So has it always been like that? And if this is so bad, such a threat, why isn't the government doing anything about it?
Yeah. Well, there's a long history of fighting between monopoly power and labor power in American history. And the most recent reason for this moment is basically what Reagan brought in. And Ronald Reagan came in with an anti-civil rights and anti-antitrust agenda and was quite explicit about it. When Reagan came into office, his sort of chief advisors put destroying antitrust at the top of their agenda. And they set about doing that both by appointing judges, but also by rulemaking changes and by convincing the country that antitrust was just this little tool used by economists for fixing small problems when there were higher prices, as opposed to this sort of fundamental threat to democracy that is also a fundamental threat to worker power. So Reagan came along and put in all of these different changes, but then when Democrats got back in power, they didn't actually roll those back. So instead, we've had from 1980 to today some tweaks along the way, but basically every administration, Clinton, Obama, along with the Bushes, has embraced this idea that antitrust is just about consumer welfare, that in general, big is fine, that consolidation is not a threat to freedom, is not a threat to worker power. And you've seen this just collapse in corporate America. Think of Pfizer, or Uber, or Unilever, or Citibank, or Nestle, or Common Spirit Health, this total collapse. In the last 10 years, we've seen 500,000 different mergers. We have a handful of companies that control home internet, seeds, books, oil corporations. So you see this consolidation in area after area, and it comes from Reagan, but Reagan followed by Clinton, and Democrats and Republicans alike haven't taken this seriously. And that really is changing. It's been changing over the last year, but we're up against some of the most powerful political forces in world history. So it's going to be a major fight.
Yeah, and you talk in the book, actually begin the book a little bit talking about the example of the chicken industry, which I think is pretty illustrative, not just because of the consolidation within the poultry industry, but also the impact on workers and how this isn't just like, convoluted Washington, D.C. inside baseball stuff. Like, this is actually getting at the emotional well-being of Americans all over this country. So could you talk a little bit about that, specific example of that industry where there's been the consolidation and how that has impacted farmers, workers, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, when I started writing this book, I did not expect to write so much about suicide and depression. But one of the real effects of consolidated power, where workers and small businesses are subject to these arbitrary, powerful forces that can cut them off, fire them, make them lose their contract, and change the terms on in a constant basis without transparency. One of the effects is that people are profoundly isolated. They're locked into contracts that don't allow them to talk to their neighbors. And you see these deep parallels between what's happening in the chicken industry and with drivers. So the first chapter is actually both about chicken farmers and about Uber and taxi drivers and the parallels that are happening there. But I started with chicken farmers because I think it's something that doesn't feel mysterious to people. You sort of have an imagination of what a farmer does. And you've seen this, you've seen the ways in which the Reaganization, this neoliberal understanding of corporate power over the last 40 years has transformed the chicken industry. So chicken farmers, basically, to get your chicken to market, you need to work with one of a handful of big monopoly distributors like Tyson. And Tyson then requires the farmer to use, of course, all their own goods, like their own seeds, their own watering system, their own consultants, but also maintains this incredible power to cut them off at any time, pay them different amounts at different periods. Is Senator Sanders here? Is that?
Yeah, so we're going to need to break
sign
up.
Was.
Yeah.
But this.
Go ahead. Okay, so yeah, actually, sorry everyone.
No, so we will continue.
Yeah, we'll pick this back up, going deeper on the harm, but we're going to turn it back to Sarah to introduce Senator Sanders very quickly. Thank you.
Yes. So as I was saying earlier, it is such an honor for us to introduce someone who really needs no introduction here. Senator Sanders has been on the front lines of this fight against monopolies on behalf of workers for decades, whether it's his work in the 1990s to stop the Pentagon from subsidizing mergers of defense contractors, his attempts to break up the banks in the aftermath of the financial crisis, his campaign to raise Amazon's minimum wage for warehouse workers, and his focus on corporate power and inequality during his transformative and inspiring campaigns for president. Senator Sanders has battled corporate power long before it became a common topic of conversation, and his moral vision and relentless advocacy for working people helped pave the way for the anti-monopoly movement. So we're all honored to have Senator Sanders with us today to talk about how we can work together to shape a new progressive America in which we see working people not as costs to be cut, but as the center of a just and flourishing society. Senator Sanders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can you all hear me, Sarah? Hello?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. I don't want to do what I've done in the past, give long speeches and nobody heard a word of it. So first of all, let me just thank all of you for focusing on this issue. I think we are, as Zephyr and Sarah indicated and others, we are making some progress, but we still have a very, very long way to go, because I think, as Zephyr just said, we're taking on everybody. When we talk about big money, when we talk about big power, we're talking about concentrated ownership in sector after sector of our society. What we are talking about this afternoon, and I apologize, by the way, for getting onto this discussion late, but I am trying to right now deal with the Democratic leadership to make sure that working families in this country get at least a minimal amount of money to survive the horrible moment that we're in. So I was involved in that and a little bit late getting on here. But bottom line is that we are looking at a moment where the big money interests have unbelievable power in almost every respect in our society. And in terms of the economy, as all of you know, we're looking not only at a massive level, grotesque level of income and wealth inequality, where even during this pandemic, when so many people are suffering, when half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, when 500,000 people are homeless, when 90 million people are uninsured or underinsured, that even in the midst of all of that, you got a handful of billionaires who are doing phenomenally well. And that is an indication of what we are doing economically. Politically, we've just come out of a campaign, not widely talked about, where billionaires spent an enormous amount of money on both sides. In fact, Biden ended up getting more billionaire money than I think Trump did. So we are looking at a movement in this country toward oligarchy from an economic perspective, and tremendous political power on the part of the billionaire class. Since 2008, just one point to be made, 49% of all new income generated in America has gone to the top 1%. Wages are stagnant for the last 47 years for workers, actually gone down in real dollars, but people on top are doing phenomenally well. So I think clearly that what we need to do is both politically make sure that big money does not control the political process. Economically, we have got to begin breaking up, which is what I know the theme of this discussion is about, breaking up these incredibly large and powerful corporations. As I think all of you know, but it's not discussed enough, absolutely not discussed enough. In the last 4 decades, nearly every single industry in America has become more concentrated. Monopolies and oligopolies rule almost every aspect of American life, from the food we eat to the airlines we fly, and even to the eyeglasses that we wear. And with less competition, these corporate behemoths are able to gouge consumers, extort suppliers, stifle innovation, drive down wages, and buy elections. That is where we are today. That's what moving toward oligarchy is about. If all of that seems familiar, that is because this dangerous trend similarly threatened our nation in a past era, and back then our government took action to stop it. Indeed, at the turn of the 20th century, Congress empowered regulators to break up monopolies and to halt consolidation, and those antitrust laws help workers gain a larger share of the economic pie. However, in recent years, the courts and regulatory agencies have been taken over by corporate ideologues determined to weaken antitrust laws and accelerate the consolidation of industries across the country. And so here we are again in a new Gilded Age, in a new era of monopolies dominating our economy and through their lobbyists writing our laws. We have seen giants like Amazon grow to control more than half of all e-commerce. I mean, take a step back, think about that. One company owned by the richest guy in the world, who's doing phenomenally well, Amazon controls more than half of all e-commerce. The company employs various tactics to harm small businesses. All the while, it pays no federal taxes and pays minimal amounts of taxes in the communities where it operates. That's what big power is about. We have seen the consolidation at a time when we have a dysfunctional healthcare system. We have seen the consolidation of large hospital systems, which command higher prices and deliver worse services. Indeed, one analysis found that after major hospital mergers, local communities saw hospital prices rise by between 11 and 54%. All the while, small, desperately needed rural hospitals are shutting down. But it's not just Amazon, it's not just healthcare. We have seen major media mergers and Silicon Valley mergers that create a handful of news and technology conglomerates that control more and more of what we read, see, and hear. And this obviously is not just an economic issue, it is an issue of democracy. Do the major corporately owned media outlets actually discuss the issues that are relevant to the needs of working people? And the answer is, in my view, they surely do not. We have also seen mega mergers like the one between T-Mobile and Sprint, which represents a gross concentration of power that runs counter to the public good. Americans deserve affordable wireless access. We are way behind much of the rest of the world in that regard. In the richest country in the history of the world, in rural Vermont, we still can't get decent cell phone service. We can't get decent broadband service. And in the midst of this pandemic, we're seeing what that means to kids who can't even do their school work online. And in rural America, and again, we don't talk about this at all, we have seen giant agribusiness conglomerates extract as much wealth out of small communities as they can, while family farmers in Vermont and throughout this country going bankrupt every single day. And as Zephyr and I think others have talked about, are treated like modern day indentured servants. These are enormously important issues. And the reason I'm happy to be with you today is we are not discussing these issues at all. The numbers regarding consolidation are absolutely stark. Today, just 4 large companies control 82% of the beef packing industry, 85% of soybean processing, 63% of pork packing, 53% of chicken processing. At the same time, Monsanto controls 80% of U.S. corn and more than 90% of U.S. soybean seed patents. A situation that has only gotten worse after the Trump administration approved Monsanto's disastrous merger with Bayer. The result, and you want to get a sense of what's going on in rural America today, for every dollar Americans spend on food, farmers are getting less than 15 cents of that dollar. 15 cents of a dollar, which is the smallest share in the modern day history of our country. None of this consolidation and attacks on consumers and workers is random, nor is it inevitable. It is happening because our government is allowing it to happen, and it is a government that is also controlled by these same damn big money interests. Our job is to come together to rediscover our American tradition of controlling corporate power and promoting fair competition through antitrust. We can halt the consolidation and concentration of our economy and reverse the trend in the same way we did a century ago. We can halt anti-competitive mergers, break up existing monopolies and oligopolies, and appoint federal regulators ready to take action on behalf of workers and consumers, not massive corporations. We can also use regulatory agencies to crack down on anti-competitive business practices, and we can institute new guidelines for proposed consolidation that make certain that large mergers are only approved if they will not harm workers, consumers, our environment, and the economy. We can do all of this. In fact, this is exactly what the American people want us to do, but it will not happen by itself. It can only happen through a grassroots, bottom-up movement that understands the challenge in front of us and then organizes against monopoly power in communities all across this country. Just last week, we saw the great power the people have to take on monopolies like Facebook. But I want to be clear, this clearly will not be an easy task. It will take all of us standing together and demanding the change that we have been discussing today. It will mean taking on the political establishment and the economic establishment of this country. The good news is, I believe, that the American people are waking up to this reality. They understand, and this pandemic has made it clearer than ever that it is unacceptable that so few have so much, not only in terms of wealth, but in terms of power, while so many have so little, both in terms of income and wealth and power. So bottom line is we can win if we organize effectively, if we educate the American people about the realities of their lives. And it is conferences like this and the work that all of you are doing that is taking us in the right direction. So I just want to thank all of you. This is enormously important stuff. It is not talked about enough. Needless to say, the corporate media is not going to talk about corporate control and consolidation in the media. So it's hard to get the word out, but you're doing it, and I applaud you for doing it. Let's go forward together. I truly look forward to working with you in the months and years in front of us. Thank you all. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders. We very much appreciate those remarks and also all you're doing to fight to get money in people's pockets during this pandemic and support workers and people all over this country. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're going to turn back now to Zephyr. So Zephyr, I'll just say, any reactions, and I think Senator Sanders touched on some important points, especially around how we're defining the harm of this consolidation, that it's not just price-based. He referenced the impact on the environment in addition to consumers. So some initial reactions and specifically on that harm definition point.
It's so powerful. And he's been such a powerful leader, and I really appreciate his leadership in this movement and his great speech. But the radical difference between these two visions of what anti-monopoly law is for. One, and this is our current law, just to be clear. One is that it is to protect against rising consumer prices. And the other is the honest one, which is the one that Senator Sanders is describing, is that we need to protect against abusive workers. We need to protect against the destruction of our environment. We need to protect against the wholesale takeover of our state legislatures and our federal legislatures and the regulatory agencies. Of course, this is a democratic problem. And of course, this is a problem for workers and small businesses. And one of the really powerful sort of features of this moment, which is what we're here for today, is to talk about how we have for 40 years treated small businesses who are facing monopolies and workers who are facing monopoly wage suppression and bad treatment as totally disconnected. And what we're seeing now with groups like Athena is workers and small business owners coming together to say, no, this is a crazy form of theft. And if we actually look at the history of anti-monopoly laws, we see that the early drafters of anti-monopoly laws understood that anti-monopoly laws were critical to protecting our freedom and our equality, and that monopoly was theft. And I think people are really feeling that during this pandemic. This is theft. When you are in a position to tell workers, we don't even have to come to the table, we're just going to pay you less. As, for instance, after the merger, Spectrum technicians were effectively told, like, we're not even going to come talk to you after the Charter Time Warner merger. You don't have a seat at the table. We are just going to extract value from you. And we have to, one of the things that's so powerful about Senator Sanders' exhortation is understanding the profound immorality and anti-democratic nature of a handful of men, and by the way, overwhelmingly white men and investors controlling the rest of society to extract from it.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the fight back against that, I mean, I think, it's something you touch on in the book, and also a question that we've already gotten from the audience. Well, how do unions play into this in terms of organizing to try to prevent some of these, the exploitation of labor and suppressing of wages, and, trying to lead that fight? You get at how it's like maybe a little complicated, the dynamic. So if you could just talk more about that. And then we'll get to solutions, we promise. This is not just going to be an overview of the problem.
It's a really important it's a really important thing to talk about in the context of the history that we've seen. When the Clayton Act was passed in 1914, one of the most important antitrust laws we have, the pen that President Wilson used to sign the Clayton Act, he sent to the head of the AFL, Gompers, who called the Clayton Act, this antitrust act, the Magna Carta for labor. So there was understanding at the time that labor, basically, to put it at the highest level, you got to make it harder for capital to organize and easier for workers to organize. And the easier it is for capital to organize, that's monopoly, the harder it is for workers. These are not two separate spheres, these are totally connected. Now, there is 110 years of history since then, including antitrust laws being used against labor, and including a period where the biggest firms actually paid better and had better benefits. This was called the large firm surplus. And when it comes to legacy firms, there still is some of that large firm surplus. But what you're seeing now is that organized capital, concentrated capital, is using its power to depress wages. So I think what you're actually in this moment, George mentioned 2008, and that was the beginning of this moment where you saw, some of the big labor unions coming out for breaking up big banks, which is a really important demand, saying it's not just enough to regulate. We actually have to go at the heart of power. As George says, this is about power. And then you've seen some moments of CWA and some labor unions resisting mergers. And then in the last year, it's like people are just switching because we are in an untenable position for organizing right now. If you are organizing delivery workers, if you are organizing in the retail industry, if you are organizing warehouse workers, you have basically companies like Amazon that bring in SWAT teams that are using both concentrated power and radical surveillance, which concentrated power allows, including surveillance on labor activity, to crush labor before it can actually get anywhere. So it's an untenable position, but it's actually really critical for labor to be at the heart of this new movement, and you're really seeing that. There was a big petition last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, to the FTC from Teamsters and other union leaders saying, hey, FTC, look at Amazon, look at how it's abusing its monopoly power. So I actually think the last 4 or 5 years has been a real switch, but we need to be supporting labor at merger moments, at other moments, to say, we recognize the untenable position and we are going to fight like hell because we need to make it easier to organize workers and harder to organize capital.
And I think Senator Sanders was getting at this too. It's like, in addition to the unions and of course, under extreme pressure and limitations about how much they can wield on their own, advocating for grassroots organizing that is also educating public around these issues. You're kind of saying it needs to be both. Is that right?
Well, we need a lot more grassroots organizing, and I meet people all the time who say, "Yeah, I'm anti-corporate," but we haven't seen people occupying the FTC, focusing on mergers. We've had 500,000 mergers in the last 10 years, 500,000 mergers globally, and in terms of activism opposing those mergers, there are a few moments around a few bank mergers. A few moments around the despised Monsanto-Bayer merger, but actually relatively little left-wing grassroots activism around corporate power. And I think what we're seeing is people are understanding, okay, we don't just protest Pfizer after the fact. We don't let Pfizer gobble up that company, so we no longer have any leverage when we're protesting. Because once you have monopoly power, they can say, hey, we're raising prices, tough luck. Mm-hmm. We're treating workers badly, tough luck. And so big corporations do take antitrust very seriously. They regularly are hiring all the antitrust attorneys from the state antitrust office. We, as progressives who care about equality, who care about dignity, who care about decent pay, who care about healthcare, who care about the environment, have to say we are going to focus on power as well as policy, and those two come together. And to me, I'm going back to George's 2008, the best example is after the 2008 crash, we didn't break up the banks. We used a regulate alone policy, but not going at power. And they just swamped DC with their lobbyists, funded campaigns at masses levels, and Dodd-Frank has been clawed back piece by piece. You have to go at the root of the power.
Well, and that's one question I got actually before our session was about this breakup versus regulation. And, you know, just listening to this, and even someone who's kind of like focused on these issues, it can sound quite daunting, right? So, you know, if you could talk a little bit about how you land on the position of needing both breaking up and regulation, in addition to that very important and critical step of organizing as one of the primary principles for policy prioritization.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I think we just have to treat as illegitimate, this is a fundamental threat to self-government. It is illegitimate to have private concentrated power. So then the question is, in some industries, you might want to nationalize, like in healthcare. You know, I support Medicare for all, and you want to go a nationalization route. However, even with Medicare for all, you still have so many pockets of the medical industry that are highly concentrated. So it doesn't actually solve the monopoly problem. So you want to do regulation, nationalization, and breakup all together. So thinking, for instance, you know, Senator Sanders has been such a leader on trying to stop consolidation in the healthcare industry while fighting for Medicare for all. And so that means looking at, okay, when we see these hospital mergers, what does that do to how nurses are treated? What does that do to the fragility of our medical system as well? But you can't say Medicare for all answers the consolidation problem in the medical industry, for instance. So there's an industry by industry approach. When it comes to big tech, for instance, I would say that something like Amazon should be broken up, which means a functional breakup. Think of it like Glass-Steagall, but for other areas where you say you can't be these two different lines of business at once. You can't be the marketplace and also run the warehouses and fulfillment that people use on the marketplace, because that basically gives Amazon this incredible power, both over workers and, as I think Sarah mentioned in the intro, a power to set the terms for what warehouse workers' conditions are. And by the way, they're not good terms. And it also gives incredible power over sellers, who then feel forced to use fulfillment by Amazon and end up paying 30% of every dollar to Amazon. Bernie was talking about how farmers are paying, basically just handing over cash to their distributors while sellers are handing over cash to Amazon. So you first do the breakup, but then I would say then Amazon should be treated like railroads, like it's a public, you know, whether you want to talk about it as public utility or common carriage, have non-discrimination principles. So there's a whole set of anti-monopoly tools. Even the title "Break It Up" can make it seem like we're talking about one horizontal breakup, but break them up means breaking up power, illegitimate private governing power. And so this, if you ever hear anybody say we should regulate instead of break up, that just is an incoherent sentence. The answer is we should break up so we can regulate, like the 2008 crash taught us. Right. We should regulate as needed in particular industries and break up horizontally and vertically at the same time.
Right. Because essentially what you're saying is until you actually have reduced the power, regulation is somewhat futile because there's just way too much control in certain corporations, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit, because you mentioned, you know, like sit-ins at FTC and thinking about the role of agencies and how organizing can put pressure there. Talk a little bit about like what the priority should be in addition to those types of sit-ins and the agencies, thinking about like, is it better to think about legislation that's going to take this problem head on, focusing on the executive branch, and also somewhat like what can be done at the state level as well, right? Because there's something state local that can also be, I mean, we're seeing the example today, the DC saying that they're going to ban non-competes in contracts, for example. So yeah, I would interested in like the different layers of how this fight can be waged, and then also where we should be thinking about priorities.
Yeah, it's there are basically 5 different levers right now. And I mentioned occupying the FTC. We should think strategically, but we should be engaged in building the grassroots, the grassroots power. So there's basically 5 different key levers. One key lever, and I'm so excited to see Congressman Cicillin here today, who has been an extraordinary leader and shown what it looks like to take on corporate power in Congress, is legislation and is federal legislation. And I think it is critical to actively support the aggressive federal legislation of the kind laid out in Cicillin's report, which calls for breakups, among other really significant changes, understanding the degree of suffering that this concentration is causing and the democratic threat it poses. So one is federal legislation. It's going to be hard, yes, but it's an area where politics are kind of weird. There's definitely left-right polling alignment. And because there's been so little leadership on this, there's more question marks than there are opponents. So a lot of people hate corporate power. When you do polling on it, you see a lot of people in support of breakups, and then a big chunk of people with a question mark. Not a lot of people have a lot of love for Visa and think, oh, well, please maintain that corporate hegemon. So its politics are interesting, and certainly Republicans at the grassroots level support a very aggressive anti-monopoly policies. So pushing that through at the federal level, seeing what we can get done. Second is what Biden can do at the agency level, and it is significant. And if you doubt me, just look at what Reagan did. Reagan came in and used agency power to transform corporate concentration in this country within a couple of years. Change the guidelines, change the definitions. So what Biden can do, ban non-competes. We're talking about agency power. A new head of the Department of Agriculture can use their power under the Packer and Stockyards Act in 1921 laws to pass laws that would break up these hegemons, these sort of gross extractors in ag, and be good for the environment, for workers, for farmers. So the agency power is really significant. I hope we're going to talk about Prop 22 later. The Department of Labor can issue guidelines around worker classification. This is a sort of a very significant assault by Uber and Lyft on worker power. We at the federal level can do something about that. So thinking about grassroots power to hold Biden-Harris accountable, to be trust busters and to use their agency power. Third is enforcement. And so also federal enforcement. And we've just seen the beginnings of federal enforcement. So much more can happen. During the Obama administration, there really were no Section 2 cases, no serious Sherman Act cases. We should see that a level of federal enforcement. But then, Morgan, to your point, the state level is really important. And at the state level, you have both enforcement. My AG, Letitia James, just led this extraordinary lawsuit against Facebook, calling for structural separation, breakups. So you have the enforcement power, but then you also have state laws. And if you have any doubt about whether states have authority over anti-monopoly, look at what Uber and Lyft just did in California. That's a state law fight. We need to be doing the opposite, turn Prop 22 upside down at the state level, and very much join protections for workers and protections against capital organizing in a way to abuse workers and small businesses. So there's a proposed state legislation that isn't yet final in New York. So there's actually 5 different levers. There's more than enough work to be done. And this is with a hostile Senate. If we have a non-hostile Senate, we're in a different place.
And I guess how optimistic are you about the incoming administration, about Congress, setting aside of it the open question around the Senate, that folks are aware of the urgency? Because I agree with you. I think we're at a totally untenable situation for workers, for people in this country. The economy is just not adding up, and resources are hoarding on one end of it for those who already have them. But as you've pointed out, and we've been talking about, some of this is that people don't necessarily understand this history, right? Or don't understand exactly like what these levers are that could do something about it that is tracked with the assault on the federal government exercising any of its authority. So how do we get over that hump? And a few people have kind of asked questions in the chat getting at that as well. So would be curious on your thoughts there.
There's still a lot of question marks in this administration. If they're serious about Vilsack, I got to be honest. Vilsack as the head of ag is kind of a punch in the face to anybody involved in the food industry, because when he came into office, there were very significant promises made about the use of the Secretary of Ag's power to protect farmers and farm workers, to protect against corporate consolidation in particular, and abuses related to corporate consolidation. And hearings were held around the country. You may have seen this on Late Night with, was it John Oliver, or was it, I think it was with a story about these hearings, but these hearings were held around the country, and farmers terrified that they would get cut off, that they would get retaliated against for speaking up, spoke up because they believed that Vilsack and the Obama administration would do something, and they did not. And instead, he's gone on to work for Big Ag. So Vilsack is a real problem. But we don't need to go too deep into the individuals. The personnel does matter. And so we'd really be looking at who the AG is, who the assistant AG responsible for antitrust is. I just don't want to stop after the appointments have been made, because I think the Biden administration is going to have to do something about the incredible devastation in the economy right now. The radical inequality that we're experiencing. We are talking about small businesses collapsing across the board, nurses begging for PPE against consolidated hospital networks, incredible, gross, disgusting inequality. And one way to take that inequality on, monopolization is theft, stop the theft. You know, if you want to see the effect of just one lawsuit, look at how a recent lawsuit against Apple led to Apple actually changing some of its terms, so money's flowing back to developers who rely on Apple. So it's as a redistributive tool, it's absolutely essential. So there's, signs go both ways. We're going to have to use a lot of pressure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Zephyr, so much. We're kickstarting this conversation. And as we mentioned at the top, this is ongoing event series. For now, we're going to turn to George to start our next panel. But I hope Zephyr will stick around, because if we have time at the end, we'll take some of the questions that are coming in as well. But thank you again, Zephyr. And
hell yes, it's great to talk to you, Morgan. Thank you.
You too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was great. You could tell everybody was having fun there. And if you haven't joined the chat, definitely do so. Some great conversation there. So yeah, I'm excited about our next panel because we're going to talk with folks who are in live fights on these exact issues. So I want to introduce our guests. We've got Saru Jayaraman, and Saru is the president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at UC Berkeley. Veena Dubal is professor of law at University of California, Hastings. And Mike Wilson is vice president at the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Local 400. And we're going to start by hearing opening remarks from each of you, hopefully under 5 minutes, and then we're going to engage in a little back and forth. And I don't know if I can see if Saru is here or not, so I can't tell. So I think I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and start with Veena, since I can see you. All right, welcome, Veena.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be at this amazing event. I've been so inspired by Zephyr and Bernie and everyone who is speaking today. It's an honor to be here. So I wanted to talk a little bit today at the outset about my work, which is in part on monopolization in transportation and logistics and its relationship to workers and consumers' rights. And I should note that in these sectors, there is a direct connection between worker and consumer rights. Monopoly and monopsony in the transportation and logistics sectors are particularly dangerous and troubling because they control both how we move and how we get goods. You know, the things that we need or want to conduct our everyday lives. And there's some really, really interesting parallels when we think about the railroad monopolies of the early 20th century and the late 19th century and what we are experiencing today. So take, for example, companies like Uber and Lyft, which many people, including low-wage workers, now rely on to get to go to work or to go to the store or to visit with friends and family. Part of the narrative that drove the path to legalizing these notoriously exploitative companies in states across the country in 2013 and 2014 was that they were disrupting a monopolistic sector, the taxi sector. And this, of course, was a false idea. It was a marketing ploy, which I'm happy to talk more about. But ironically, Uber and Lyft's business model is built entirely on the monopolization of the entire transportation sector, including public transportation. So notably, neither company has ever been profitable because they offer prices that are below cost, prices that are often cheaper than even public transportation. Uber, for its part, has lost more than $11 billion in just the last 3 years. And the intention in offering these anti-competitive prices is to lure consumers in, to eliminate or to severely undercut other forms of private and public transportation options, and to make entire populations of people dependent upon these companies for their mobility. This has also meant partnering with government. Cities, and more recently, the federal government, which just awarded Uber an almost $1 billion federal contract, cities and more recently the federal government are using Uber to supplant public transportation. So part of the business model has also been and will continue to be to keep costs low by robbing workers of their wages and benefits. So Uber and Lyft, once they've captured the market and created a regulatory environment suitable to their business model, will then begin to raise prices on consumers. And meanwhile, the companies grow their unprecedented power, not just to coordinate the transportation market, but also to collect and use data in ways that we cannot see or fully understand because of information asymmetries to exploit workers and consumers. So tragically in California, which was the first state to legalize these companies, we've seen this entire plan play itself out over the last 8 years. The legislature passed a law that you may have heard of called AB 5, which made it very clear that workers of these companies were being misclassified as independent contractors and deserved the panoply of employment protections offered by California employment law. The California judiciary issued an injunction to force these companies to pay their workers a minimum wage and provide workers' compensation, paid sick leave, to pay unemployment insurance taxes, among other basic worker protections. And the companies responded by putting a $204 million record-breaking proposition on the 2020 ballot, which robbed workers of all of these basic protections and created a new category of worker that has neither the control of a small business person nor the rights of a low-wage worker. These companies passed the initiative through a combination of misinformation and harassment. And today, as Prop 22 goes into effect and workers are sleeping in their cars and are food insecure, prices have predictably gone up for consumers. Frighteningly enough, Prop 22 may also bolster the concentrated market power of companies like FedEx and Amazon through further worker exploitation. Venture capitalists have already articulated to the public and to politicians their desire to expand a Prop 22-like law into other states and also into other markets, including healthcare, education, retail, and hospitality. These monopolization tactics, which are rooted in worker exploitation and are good for no one but the executives and shareholders of these companies, pose a direct assault on democracy, not just because we live by their rules and not our rules, but because working people don't have the time and space to engage in politics and governance. In California today, hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers, mostly people of color who are labeled essential, labor in the transportation and delivery sectors, and yet they can work all day and actually lose money rather than earn a secure living wage. Meanwhile, Dara Khosrowshahi, Uber CEO, has a $45 million a year pay package and $100 million of equity waiting for him.
Wow, thanks, Vina. So clear and powerful. Looking forward to digging in on some questions, but now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to walk us through some of his opening comments. Thanks for being here, Mike.
And for having me with this amazing group that's here talking today. You know, for us at United Food and Commercial Workers, I think a lot of what Zephyr and Morgan is talking about really resonates. I mean, these companies and employers in the retail and food processing industry are organized. Their power has grown, and we are just not. Unionization in this country has dropped to its lowest levels in a long time, and that's really, I think, what we need to turn around here. And as has been discussed, a lot of that has to do with power, and it has to do with the power that we have as working people versus the power that these corporations over time have been able to consolidate. And I think wanted to give kind of two recent examples from our own local union about what that can sometimes look like, even with companies that are already organized. So, we operate in the Mid-Atlantic region, both in the Washington, D.C. market, but also in more rural parts of the Mid-Atlantic and West Virginia, and Southern and Southwest Virginia. But in the D.C. market, one of our main employers is Albertsons Safeway. And we recently were in a big fight with them that had to do with pension obligations that they owed and were trying to get out of. And what we were facing in that circumstance was a company that over time has grown into one of the largest operators in the country and is controlled by a private equity firm that at that time was controlled by Cerberus, one of the big private equity players. And even here in a big market with a fair amount of competition, most of that competition comes from other big players, whether it's Walmart, Giant, which is part of the Ahold Delhaize conglomerate, or Harris Teeter, which is part of Kroger. We were really we were dealing with a situation where that consolidation had led to standardization in the industry, and one of the things that even the union employers are trying to get out of is their pension obligations. And even here in a big media market, it was tough to figure out how to take that kind of what was a local fight into a national picture and really focus on what the problem was with that consolidation and with the Cerberus control. We could impact their bottom line, but we're also geographically isolated from their West Coast base. In the past, a lot of the decisions about these kinds of costs and things were division level here on the East Coast, but we really had to get the attention of Cerberus and get the attention of those larger players in order to make an impact and get what we needed for our members. We were able to do that successfully through a lot of work both on the ground in terms of educating our members about what it meant to be private equity controlled, in terms of educating the press and getting some national news stories around what was going on here in the DC area. And we're able to get the money out of Cerberus to shore up those pension plans. But a lot of these things end up being short-term victories in what is a larger-term fight. I mean, what we were able to win there does not change the overall dynamic that we face with Safeway, Albertsons, and the kind of private equity control that is happening within the industry. The other example, just in a different market, is with Kroger, the largest traditional grocery chain in the United States. They've been making a lot of money during this pandemic. We represent a group of their stores in West Virginia, obviously a more rural part of the country, a smaller market where they're by far the biggest player and don't have a lot of competition. In that circumstance, this was during the pandemic, once it had already started, they were really trying to push to reduce their healthcare costs despite the ongoing pandemic. And in that case, we really had to create a real, actual, credible strike threat there for the first time in a long time in order to get Kroger to back down on what has been a national push from them to reduce their healthcare costs. And this is a company, again, that doesn't need to reduce their healthcare costs from a perspective of how much money they were making prior to the pandemic and now during it. But it's a company that wants to be in line with the other large players in the retail industry that have been moving further and further away from providing affordable healthcare to their employees. So again, we were able to have a victory there, but that was only because of the strength of our members being organized and fighting back on these companies, as well as some, decent press work and things like that to get the story out there. But not everybody has that opportunity. And as we continue this conversation and talk more about places like Amazon or Walmart or other big consolidators within our industries, or even in food processing, a lot of workers don't have that, and the laws are stacked against us from organizing to get that.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to come back to you later with a question around how we build a bigger base around these issues, which I can tell you've got some answers based on experience. Great. Next up, we're going to hear from Saru Jayaraman. Saru is the president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at UC Berkeley. Hey.
Thanks, George. And I apologize because I'm just jumping in from another event. So apologies if I'm out of context or anything like that, but really happy to be here. As I think most people know, or probably most people don't know, but people who know me know, my organization, I lead something called One Fair Wage, and before that led the Restaurant Opportunity Center. We've been organizing to raise wages and working conditions in the restaurant industry and sub-minimum wages for the last very long period of time. And 20 years now. And we come to this conversation because we've been up against a trade lobby in the form of the National Restaurant Association that has been acting like a monopoly or a collusion or a cabal of restaurants that have basically, in my opinion, engaged in price fixing, have engaged in setting a wage for the industry that is a sub-minimum wage and a direct legacy of slavery. So just quick history, for those that don't know, the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic was the second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer in the United States of America, second only to retail as the largest private sector employer, almost 14 million workers nationally. 1 in 10 Americans worked in restaurants prior to the pandemic. And yet, despite its size and growth, it was always the absolute lowest paying employer. And that was largely due to the money, power, and influence of this trade lobby that most people had never even heard of, the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It does wield in many ways as much power and influence as the Rifle Association, but most people are not aware of the Restaurant Association. It represents the chains. And in doing research for my last book, we uncovered that the other NRA has been around 150 years since emancipation of slavery, when it first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on this newfangled idea that had just come from Europe at the time called tipping. Tipping originated in feudal Europe as an extra or bonus to a wage, but it became a replacement for wages because of slavery. And so the Restaurant Association pioneered the idea of basically extending the idea of not paying Black people and then all people, because over time, this notion of not paying Black people a wage at all and letting them live on tips became law, federal law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage for the first time, except for groups of Black workers, farm workers, domestic workers, and of course, tipped restaurant workers. And we went from zero in 1938 for a wage for tipped workers all the way up to the incredible $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States of America. And 43 states in the United States continue with this legacy of slavery, basically with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And it's been a source of economic insecurity and sexual harassment for millions of mostly women across the country. But what was an issue of race and gender and economic injustice has become an issue of life or death during the pandemic, as so many millions of women are being asked to work in restaurants now, enforce social distancing and mask rules on the very same customers from whom they have to get tipped. 2 weeks ago, we released a report showing that there's been a huge increase in sexual harassment, and women in this industry are being asked to remove their masks so men can judge their looks and therefore their tips on that basis. So it's become a matter of life and death. But here's how we come to this conversation. Over the last 7 years, as we've been running this campaign, we've been working with hundreds of amazing independent restaurant owners who've said, I want to go a different way. I don't want to participate in a legacy of slavery or social harassment. And they have been attacked and sued and denounced by the National Restaurant Association, which has acted like a monopoly. You know, what is monopolistic behavior? You try to crush anybody who comes you know, in any kind of way against you. So employers who've tried to do something different have been attacked openly by the National Restaurant Association. And you know, the craziness is that we still have many very blue states, Democratic legislators and Democratic governors that roll over to the desires and whims of the Restaurant Association, and enough is enough. We've been organizing workers, they've been striking, they've been saying we're not going back to work without one fair wage, and it's time for all of us to acknowledge monopolies and this kind of work of antitrust take many different forms. There are the companies like Disney that are part of the National Restaurant Association and very clearly a monopoly in the true sense of the word. But the Restaurant Association itself acts in this way as an oligopoly, and we have to recognize it for that and to call on legislators to stop associating themselves with that as well.
Thank you. Awesome, and a unique challenge, but probably, yeah, one we got to talk about more and more places, or maybe not that unique. We just don't talk about it enough. Thank you.
Right.
Hey, Vina, I'm wondering, like, as you look forward, especially on transportation monopolies, like, where do you see openings for us? And like, what are the policy handles we should be looking at now? And are there places where you think we have more leverage in some of these fights?
I should unmute myself. So I think that we are going to have to go on the offensive because we have so been on the defensive with misclassification and monopolization in the private transportation sector. There was a brief moment when California passed AB 5 when there was a lot of excitement about the potential of the ABC test to fight worker misclassification in states across the country. And these companies have with Prop 22 sort of stamped that enthusiasm and excitement out. But part of what the Biden-Harris administration has articulated as their vision for worker power and to fight misclassification, exploitation, and monopolization practices that emerge through this exploitation is to adopt the ABC test on a federal level. So depending on what happens in Georgia, I think we should all be very excited about and aggressively pushing our corporate Democrats to vote in favor of the PRO Act. That would be a humongous win for working people and push back against these corporate concentration practices. In addition, we should be looking at state AG's offices and putting whatever sort of pressure we can, political pressure, to have them enforce existing employment rights for workers that labor for these companies in states across the country. As Zephyr articulated, there is a lot that can be done at the Department of Labor to change guidelines of around worker classification. And I think really importantly, we need to be supporting in every way that we can independent worker organizing. And that means worker organizing that is not just looking to raise wages, but that is really invested in building worker power. So for folks who are listening who work for foundations, who are in philanthropy, who are in a position to give, that is, we don't need new apps, we don't need new innovative ways to give workers a measly portable benefit. What we need is a real financial, psychological, emotional, and physical investment in worker power so that we can break them up and allow workers who work every day for hours a day the dignity of being able to put money in their bank accounts, to put food on the table, and have a roof for their families.
Awesome. Thank you, Vina. So a lot of people have raised in the chat the fact that we need more workers and everyday folks engaged in these fights and have to maybe kind of move them out of just kind of, insider policy stuff. So love to hear from Saru and Mike, like, what can we do to help more people see these fights as part of their fights? I think we also acknowledge a lot of people do see these fights as part of their fights. Don't want to say that, but as organizers, what are some things we know works and we could do more of? Maybe start with Saru and then go to Mike.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I saw in the chat some conversation about this phenomenon that happened to us where some workers came out against raising wages, and people don't know the background of that. Actually, John Oliver happened to profile it in his show last week tonight, a show on astroturfs, because that is what this was. It was an astroturf effort by the National Restaurant Association, which saw Trump do this amazing thing during his campaign, which is convince working people to fight against their own interests in some way. And so they hired the Trump-Pence communications firm, and with them created a PAC called Save Our Tips, and started spreading this mythology among restaurant workers that their tips would go away if their wages went up. And the truth is that the states that have a full minimum wage have higher tipping averages than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage. Why? Because in those states, workers get paid more, restaurant workers go out more, they spend more, and they tip better, because anybody who's ever worked in this industry knows if you work in this industry, you tip better. So tipping is higher in the 7 states with one fair wage, but fear is, as we saw in 2016, such a unique driver, and they were able to use that to convince especially higher tipped white male servers that their tips would go away if their wages went up, and also through dog whistling convince them that somehow Black women of color who work in would get a raise and come up closer to where they were. So we have been fighting that mythology and giving people a sense of hope, because we know that the best way to combat fear is hope, organizing workers. But honestly, the pandemic, I've never seen anything like the pandemic in terms of helping us open people's eyes and organize, because several things happened. One, 60% of those tipped workers, some of whom had bought into that mythology that if their wages went up, their tips would go away, 60% couldn't get unemployment insurance. 60 couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told by most of these states that their sub-minimum wage plus tips was too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. For a lot of workers, being told by a state that your wage is too low sent off these signals. Maybe my wage is too low. If the state is telling me it's too low to get benefits, probably my wage is too low. Probably tips are not a reliable source of income. So that led a lot of workers to change their mind on the issue. But the biggest thing was, you're telling me you want me to go back to work for a sub-minimum wage, risk my life in one of the most dangerous environments. The CDC has named restaurants as one of the most dangerous environments to get the virus, when tips are down 50 to 75%. We have never seen so many workers say, I will not go back to work without a full livable minimum wage. So much so that we organized strikes in multiple cities of workers saying we won't go back without one fair wage. And we were then able to educate them on who the NRA was, what they had done, how they had set up this AstroTurf PAC, how they had tried to quash companies that tried to do something different, and how they act, as somebody said in the chat, like a cartel. How they act like a cartel, and that our power as workers comes from standing up collectively across the country to the likes of the National Restaurant Association and demanding, frankly, especially demanding of Democrats, who unfortunately we are very disappointed with in many states, who roll over to the Restaurant Association, telling them, as much as you are so crying and lamenting about the need for relief for small businesses and the restaurant and hospitality industry, you cannot forget workers in those relief packages. They must be a part, and workers are standing up in the cold weather, even when they're being told they can't go outside, to demand that.
Oh, so much in there. Before I hand it to Mike, I feel like what you really described to me sounds like just good old-fashioned organizing. We get in a fight and deepen the analysis along the way and point out the bigger
The
structure.
crises help.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like, that just felt like another, the crises opened up some moment where people were waking and ready for a fight. And then I just want to name what you named, the kind of classic divide and conquer strategy among workers. It looks like in this case, very much with been pretty classic race and gender as that dividing point. So many big ideas in there. With that, Mike, love to hear what you've got to say on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I 100% agree with what Saru was talking about. I mean, like there are these moments where we can really take advantage of crises to really educate and bring people together. I think the other and it requires Prop 22 was another one of those moments to be able to try and organize people as something was going to immediately impact them. But I think in the long term too, I mean, I think that Zephyr was earlier talking about the need to break up these monopolies and break up this corporate power in order to regulate. I think in some ways that needs to happen in order for us to be able to organize. I mean, when you look at the way that labor law has evolved over the past 30 or 40 years, there's not protections for people who want to stand up for themselves, who want to speak out about these issues, unless they already have some sort of union or organizational protection. I mean, our members have been able to talk about what's going on in their workplaces during COVID, are able to speak out about their wages and working conditions, not because of any law that theoretically protects them, but because they have the power of an organization and a union behind them. That doesn't happen in other industries right now. And it doesn't happen in the non-union parts of the industries that we represent. And I think, there's theoretical laws on the books about retaliation and about the right to organize. But, when the National Labor Relations Act was passed, it was about making sure, it was about promoting collective bargaining in this country. And that's not what it is anymore. It holds workers back. And I think that what really needs to happen now is for that long-term deep organizing to continue, beyond these issues and into making sure that people really understand the power that they have when they do come together. I was referencing our fight with Albertsons Safeway over last year. And, one thing we were able to do with that was really educate a lot of people in our membership about the dangers of consolidation and private equity. Now, where we go with that, I mean, that's on us to a certain extent, right? But I think that kind of organizing and education is very difficult to do outside of the context of a labor union or outside of the context of another existing organization where people feel like they have that power to act together. And I think what has happened over the years through this consolidation is just the weakening of the ability of workers and others to do that. And that's what we need to fight back against.
Thanks, Mike. You want to pick that up, Vina?
Yeah, I wanted to just emphasize something that Mike said, which is that part of why it has been so different, part of why Prop 22 even passed in California is because although Uber and Lyft sort of invented this business model, or at least extended this business model in which they misclassify people via an app, since the inception around 2013, labor unions have been very skeptical about investing in organizing. Why? Because if these workers are found to be independent contractors under the National Labor Relations Act, organizing them puts the unions in a position where they could be financially liable for antitrust violations. So while you have these huge monopolies in which no one is doing anything about, workers on the ground who are trying to organize with one another, who are misclassified as independent contractors, have to be afraid that they will be accused of price fixing, of colluding when they are trying to raise their basic wages. So in California, unfortunately, what you've seen after the passage of Prop 22 is that whatever little money that unions were putting in trying to invest in worker organizing is really drying out. You still have groups like Rideshare Drivers United, where they have 50 volunteer drivers on the ground organizing every day, but they are organizing without anything, without any resources, without the law behind them, and they're organizing against these multi-billion-dollar companies that are backed not just by venture capital, but by powerful corporate Democrats.
All right, thank you. So last question, maybe a couple minutes each. We're in a big transition at the federal level. Like, what do you see as the big priorities or openings for workers in the next administration and Congress? And maybe we'll go with Saru, Mike, and Vina, and then we'll close this panel. Thank you all.
Yeah, I mean, I am very hopeful because I think this incoming administration has been pushed to the left and to call out actually things that hadn't been specifically called out before by any Democratic campaign or administration. So in their platform, in our case, in their platform, the Biden-Harris campaign specifically named $15 and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and for workers with disabilities in their jobs platform, their women's agenda, and their racial equity agenda, which shows that not only did they see it as a priority, but they understood the intersectionality of the issue, which I have never seen before. They understood that this is a legacy of slavery. They understood that that this is an issue of racial inequality, because unfortunately, tipping is biased. You know, tipping is not based on good service in America. It's based on all of our race and gender inequities and biases. So the fact that they named that was really big. The fact that they have actually done things to then make it a priority through who they're naming in the transition team and for nominees is really incredible. And I am hopeful that we can move to push back on the National Restaurant Association and eliminate the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and raise wages in generally. First maybe through executive actions and eventually when the Senate flips. But I do want to say that beyond raising wages, I want to see, and I will continue to push, because listen, I think everybody probably in this gathering, but maybe we need to encourage our friends in the broader left, knows the mistake we all made during the Obama years was not enough push, not enough groundswell, not enough telling our own friends that, we're here and we demand and we are pushing. So, a moment when you've got an administration moving in the right direction is not the moment to sit back and say, oh, let's work with them and, let's have access to power and we're so happy and yay. It's the moment to push harder. I mean, the right doesn't do this. The right doesn't sit back when their people come into office and breathe a sigh of relief and go on and do their own thing. They push. And that's what we must be doing. We must be pushing not only for 15 and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, but a complete disavowal and disassociation of the National Restaurant Association and everything that those trade lobbies represent, everything that they've represented for the last 150 years, the way that they act as a cartel and all the other issues on which they're so wrong, from paid sick leave to pregnancy discrimination to ag-gag laws, everything. And so I am hopeful, both because they are doing and saying the right things and we're working with them, and because I am hopeful to work with my brothers and sisters in the movement to continue to push and not sit back.
Thank you, Saru. And just let's be clear, the fact that the Biden team is where they're at right now with this amazing analysis is not an accident, and a credit to you and how committed you've been to this work for so long. And so it's awesome. It's amazing. Mike?
Yeah, no, I mean, 100% agree with that. I mean, I think that everything that is out there right now from the Biden administration or the incoming Biden administration that is on the right track has to do with all of the work that folks on this panel and other people who have spoken and everyone in the movement has done over the last 4 years and well before that to set the table for this. And now, as Saru was saying, it's time to really continue to push this so that these things can actually take place over the next 4 to 8 years or longer. I think just to start with the bad, I think, it was mentioned earlier about Tom Vilsack with the Secretary of Agriculture. Obviously we're not happy about that either. We represent workers in food processing and in chicken plants and things like that. And really we're hoping to see somebody go into that role who was going to be committed to pushing back against the consolidated companies in that industry. I mean, poultry plants are one of the worst places to work right now, I would say, in the country. And it's gotten worse with COVID, obviously, with line speeds and the way that people are forced to work in those plants. It's just atrocious. And it's kind of sad to think that right now the setup is that not much is ready to be done about that, but hopefully that can change as we continue to exert that pressure. I think the other two places that, we really see opportunities here is, one, in the immediate with OSHA. I mean, it's been a complete abdication of responsibility under the Trump administration, obviously in almost every way in the federal government, but OSHA has been, during this pandemic, has been a real clear example of that failure. Some states, including Virginia, where we operate, have passed emergency standards to help with that. but there's nothing that can replace, having actual enforcement and standards through the federal government, through OSHA. And the other thing, as I touched on before, is labor law reform. I mean, one of the big failures, I think, of all of us 12 years ago was, the Employee Free Choice Act, when the Obama administration was first elected and there was full Democratic control of both houses of Congress. We did not get that done. And things have only gotten worse over the last 12 years when it comes to the ability of workers to organize and exercise their power. And if we don't do something about that in this administration, it's just going to get worse and worse, and it's just going to get more and more difficult for workers to speak up and exercise their power. So I think that's where we need to go.
Thank you so much, Mike, and plus on the big Vilsack miss. Amazing. Veena, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see a lot of things. I would love to see the Federal Trade Commission embrace its originally intended role of protecting fair competition, which by definition must include labor standards, which would, of course, facilitate the survival of smaller businesses that treat their workers more fairly. I would love to see the PRO Act passed, especially if Democrats have control of the Senate. I would love to see an executive order put in place that puts the ABC test into effect for the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. As Zephyr Teachout pointed out, we can do a lot with the Department of Labor, change the guidelines around worker classification, get rid of non-competes. But let me also say two things that we really need to look out for. We need to look out for these dog whistles, portable benefits, and as the companies use this term, and as finance uses this term, sectoral bargaining. Any kind of sectoral bargaining that exchanges employee rights should be unacceptable to the left, to unions, and to working people. And as I think about that, I also want to say that we really need to see a cultural shift. We should not, as progressives, leftists, or even Democrats, sanction or accept these corporate Democrats for the Obama administration back into the Biden administration. These monopolies need to be shut down. These people have made their bed and now need to lay in it. There cannot be this sort of back and forth between industry and good governance and good government. And it just needs to be something that we culturally do not accept for politics and government in this country.
Totally agree with that. I love that. Hey, thank you all for the incredible insight. And I feel like the clear reminder that this is an organizing challenge, like that good things happen when we organize, and that's what we're going to have to do to address these issues. So with that, I would like to introduce Congressman David Cicillin, who is chair of the House Antitrust Subcommittee. Thank you for being with us today, Congressman, and for your leadership on these exact issues. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, George. It's great to be with all of you, and of course, a pleasure to join Senator Sanders and Zephyr Teachout and all of the incredible panelists at today's event. I'd like to begin by recognizing the incredible work of the American Economic Liberties Project and People's Project to raise public awareness about the dangers of unchecked monopoly power. This work is essential to promoting justice and inclusivity across our economy. America's monopoly problem touches nearly every facet of our lives, which is why it's so important to connect progressive organizations from across the spectrum. We're at a really critical juncture. Our economy is simply not working. For too long, consolidation among competing firms has stifled innovation and opportunity. Over the course of the past several decades, our competition system has fundamentally shifted to favor corporate power over competition. Rather than companies competing fiercely to provide quality goods and services for American consumers at affordable prices, competition has materially weakened across the economy. We've also retreated from rules that were designed to protect and expand economic security and the dignity of hardworking Americans. And in their place, record levels of inequality have appeared, executive compensation has skyrocketed while wages have flattened and labor protections have weakened, innovation and dynamism have declined, and the middle class has been hollowed out. We cannot afford to ignore these trends and their harmful consequences. When people are left behind by prosperity, as they increasingly are, and they cannot afford their medication or must drive their children to a parking lot for internet access to complete their schoolwork, they feel powerless and trapped. And as several of the experts at today's events have made clear, there's ample evidence that people are paying higher prices and have lower incomes than they would in a competitive economy. This is nothing less than a monopoly tax on American families. And this problem has only gotten worse in the wake of the pandemic. It's clear that our economy is working fine for a handful of dominant firms that have market caps in the trillions of dollars. But it's not working for countless workers, small businesses, and startups that form the economic backbone of our communities. And that's why Congress must reassert its role in economic policymaking and oversight of concentrated economic power. For most of the last century, Congress played an active role in shaping competition in the economy by writing and updating the antitrust laws to stop excessive corporate concentration and anti-competitive conduct. But for the past 40 years, Congress has sat idly by as courts warped the legislative intent of the antitrust laws. To reverse this trend, we conducted a comprehensive bipartisan investigation into the state of competition in online markets, a critical piece of our current and future economy. One of our main goals of this top to bottom review is to roll up our sleeves and understand how these markets work. It's been decades since Congress conducted an antitrust investigation. As the Supreme Court recognized in 1957 in Watkins versus the United States, this form of oversight is essential to our legislative powers. As the court noted, Congress's oversight power is broad and it encompasses inquiries concerning the administration of existing laws, as well as proposed or possibly needed statutes. It includes surveys of defects in our social, economic, or political system for the purpose of enabling Congress to remedy them. That is the true purpose of congressional oversight, and it's the responsibility that we cannot shirk and must conduct broadly within each committee's jurisdiction. For example, under the leadership of the late Chairman Elijah Cummings and now Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney, the Committee on Oversight has conducted a wide-ranging investigation into the skyrocketing prices of prescription drugs since January 2019. Since then, the Oversight Committee has held several hearings with the CEOs of Novartis, Amgen, and other drug makers about the soaring costs of prescription drugs and is preparing a final report as part of its investigation. This work is critical to both documenting and understanding competition problems in drug markets, as well as solving these problems through legislation. We need much more of this important work across Congress and to really revive this tradition of meaningful oversight. And although these are incredibly challenging times, doing nothing is just not an option. We have to keep fighting and continue to work relentlessly to improve the lives of every American. And I'm eager to work and follow up on this important initial steps that we will be taking with many of you. And I really want to thank everyone who has been part of this movement, because our investigation really came about as a result of an understanding of the fact that our digital markets were not working, that this economic concentration resulted in significant harm to consumers and workers, innovation, and small businesses. And now we begin the difficult work of actually legislating to fix that. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been involved in this space for a very long time, for your advocacy, for your voice, for your passion, and look forward to continuing our work together. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Congressman. We appreciate you. And I think if there's one thing that's clear from our discussion today, it's that all of these issues start with leadership. And so the work that you've done to lead the Antitrust Subcommittee, to put out the report on big tech, and really create a prototype for what needs to be happening in every sector. We couldn't be more grateful for your leadership as part of this movement, as we try to take on corporate power and recenter the rights of workers and people across this country to be more economically stable. So thank you again for joining us. And as we've noted again and again, this is a series. We are going to be diving into a lot of the sectors that we've talked about today: healthcare, agriculture, restaurants, tech. And we really need to be not thinking divisively, but how we can all come together, that whatever your issue is that you're focused on in the policy, grassroots organizing, academic sector, there's a corporate consolidation problem behind it. And we want to continue to work with you and highlight how we can organize around these issues to fight back. So please continue to join us for the series. If you're not already doing so, follow along Economic Liberties, and we will be in touch with our next event. Thank you so much.